everyone. Welcome to my channel From Dream to Seed. My name is Jessica, and today I wanted to share some best practices for in-ground gardening. Now this is actually video number 4 in my beginner gardener series. So if you haven't checked out my other 3 videos, I highly suggest them, especially my second video, which is all about soil testing, because I will mention soil testing today as part of a best practice for in-ground gardening. But today I just wanted to share some quick tips about ways to successfully in-ground garden. And what I mean is, this isn't raised bed gardening, this isn't container gardening, this is actually gardening in the ground. So I wanted to give you some quick tips and some different ways that you can in-ground garden that will help you be more successful. Now, I talked a little bit on my last video about picking the location of your garden, and you want to make sure for an in-ground garden bed that you are picking an area that is not too low in the ground where it's going to collect water and the drainage is not going to be very good. You also don't want to pick an area that is extremely sloped, because then you're going to have the exact opposite problem. You're going to have a lot of water drainage. Now the area that I'm in right now is slightly sloped, but it's a small enough of a grade that I'm not going to get too many problems, I think, from water draining too fast. So these are brand new in-ground garden beds that I've been working on for about 6 months now. And I'm going to kind of walk you through how I set up my garden. This is one way to do it. You don't have to do it this way. This is actually a method you can do if you're not in a rush to start your in-ground garden, or you have some time. And I've really found that this has worked really well so far. So I did get my soil tested, as I mentioned before, and I highly recommend that, because it's going to tell you your soil pH, is going to tell you any nutrient deficiencies that you have in your soil, lots of good information. So if you haven't checked out that video, I suggest you watch that video first. But I did get my soil tested, so I had a pretty good idea of the pH of the soil. I had a pretty good idea of the organic matter or lack of organic matter in my soil, and I had a really good idea of the nutrients that I needed to add. So I wasn't in a huge rush, and I wanted to make sure that I had really good soil when it came time for me to plant. Now, as I mentioned before, I live in a neighborhood, and this is a fairly new build neighborhood. So I do not have a lot of topsoil in my backyard. Now, I have had lawn that was growing in this area for several years, and that grass does help improve the soil somewhat. It adds nitrogen to the soil, and it helps build that topsoil layer back up. Now, I have a few different things that I'm planning on doing with these new garden beds. I'm going to be planting quite a few berries, but in this area right behind me, I'm going to be putting in a perennial flower bed. And although they need different nutrients and things as far as how they grow, for the most part, any plant will do well in good soil. So I wanted to kind of show you the different types of soil you might be dealing with. And this is a really good thing to assess before you start your in-ground garden bed. Now, some of you might be lucky enough to have great soil. And what makes great soil? Well, soil that is rich in organic matter, that drains really well, not too heavy clay, not too heavy sand. So you're going to have things that look like this. So very dark. You can see kind of bits and pieces of sticks and mulch and things, and all these are organic matter. And these are things that can make your soil really well draining and really nutrient rich. However, this was not the soil that I started out with here. Like so many of you probably have heavy clay soil like I did, which means it looks like this. It looks like a rock. It's very light in color, so you can see there's little organic matter in it, which is what makes it this light color. It's very dense. I can break it almost like a rock. I could probably knock you out if I threw it at you. So, or you might have the opposite problem where you have extremely gritty feeling soil. The water just drains right through, and that's sandy soil. So although sandy soil and clay soil aren't bad in and of themselves. There's plenty of native plants that prefer those types of soils. However, most of the plants that you're planting in a veggie garden, and even most of our flowers that we're planting, are not native to our area. So they're going to want a really nutrient dense, organic matter dense soil. So how do I improve this? Well, like I said, I wasn't in a huge rush, so I had some time before I knew I was going to plant these beds. So I actually started back in the early fall, I think late September. And so what I did was I collected all my Amazon boxes. I asked around for the neighbors, asked if they had any large cardboard boxes, and I completely covered this area in cardboard boxes. Now, I did not kill off the grass before that, and that was for a couple reasons. Number one, I I wanted that grass to break down underneath the cardboard because it adds organic matter to the soil. It adds nitrogen back into the soil. So I laid cardboard in a single layer, but it was thick cardboard. And then I carted in truckloads of compost. And what is compost? Compost is broken down organic matter, and it can be anything from sticks to leaves to grass to plant matter to food scraps, all kinds of things. But it is basically organic matter, and it is a really, really good thing to have in your garden, whether you have clay soil or sandy soil or anything, because compost is the perfect blend of a substance that can drain water and also hold on to water when it needs to, and there's not really a soil that compost can't improve. So no matter what type of soil you're starting off with, compost is something that's really a really good additive. So I added probably about 4 to 6 inches of compost on top of that cardboard. And I had soil testing done, like I said, and so I knew I wasn't lacking in a whole lot of nutrients, but I went ahead and just laid just a very general organic fertilizer over top. I let that sit for maybe about a month, and then I actually planted a cover crop on top of this compost. And I'll insert a picture so you can see. I planted clover because clover is a really good, what we call nitrogen fixer plant. So it will actually add a lot of nitrogen into the soil, which is what I wanted. And also having a cover crop, it will keep the soil protected over the winter. So I'm not having harsh winds blow away the soil, I'm not having erosion. And so having that cover crop was really beneficial in many ways to protect the soil over the winter. So if you're not in a rush or you're in an area where you want to improve the soil first, I really suggest cover crops. Now I could do a whole video on cover crops, but you want to look up an annual cover crop, something like buckwheat or clover, although clover is technically a perennial in some areas, but this will really improve your soil, and you can just let it grow over the whole summer or into the fall, or just let it sit on the soil over winter. And then what I did is a few weeks ago, I went in with a tiller and I tilled this whole area. So I tilled all that clover in, and it was enough to pretty much kill off the clover. But tilling in that clover adds more organic matter into the soil. And I know I keep saying that, but having organic matter in your soil is really important. And then I went back and I added another few inches of compost. So I still need to do this on a few areas of my bed where I'm actually going to be planting berries. So I'm going to take you along and show you that last few feet of where I need to put compost. And I'm also going to be laying down another organic fertilizer. So I talked a little bit in my last video, or no, excuse me, 2 videos ago, about my soil pH being really high, and berries do not like a high soil pH. So I also added organic sulfur to the areas that I knew I was going to be planting berries in. And what sulfur does is it decreases that pH into a range that berries like more. So I just got my soil, I sent off a soil sample, and I'm hoping it'll tell me that my soil is better now. But I'm adding down an organic fertilizer, and I use several different ones, but this is the one I'm using now, and this is Berry Tone from Espoma. And it's a really good organic granular fertilizer. And another reason I really like it is because it has sulfur in it, just a little bit. So it will continue to acidify the soil for my berries. So I'm going to try this out this year and see how it does. So I'm going to take you along right now and show you how I'm adding more compost and adding more fertilizer to the garden. Okay, finished with that. Now normally I would water that fertilizer in, but we're actually expecting rain tomorrow morning, so that'll save me from having to drag out the hose. But normally you would want, if you're not expecting rain anytime soon, you want to water that granular fertilizer in. And that organic fertilizer will break down over time. It's a lot slower than a liquid fertilizer, but it will break down over time and add nutrients to the soil and also lower the pH. So this bed is pretty much ready to go for me to plant in. I'm just waiting for the weather to stop dropping in the 20s at night and stop snowing in April to plant some perennial plants that I've got going from seed. So what if you don't want to wait 6 months like I did to start a new garden bed? Well, there's plenty of other things you can do. One of the reasons that I do prefer this method though is because I did a one-time till-in and I'm not going to till anymore. So every year I will just add a few extra inches of compost, and this is kind of what's called a no-dig garden bed. And the reason I prefer no-dig is because it doesn't disturb the soil. It kind of mimics nature in like the forest where leaves are dropping and composting down, and it feeds the trees and circle of life. But I prefer the no-dig because I'm not disturbing the organisms and the biodiversity in the soil. I'm not disturbing the worms, which I really want. And so I'm kind of just leaving it alone. And every year I just add compost on top of that. And because I started with the cardboard, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the cardboard it serves a dual purpose. Not only does it kill the grass and the weeds, if you have a lot of weeds in your area underneath, but it also adds organic matter to the soil, and the worms love it. So I did plant roses recently in this area, and there were just worms everywhere, which is great. So if you have worms in your soil, it's a sign of healthy soil. So what if you don't want to wait to start your in-ground garden bed? Well, there's several things you can do. So you can just go ahead and till up the area. Now, if you do have a lot of weed seeds in that area, you might want to consider laying down a landscaping fabric once you've done a till to help kind of kill off the weeds that might resprout and come back up. Or you can use cardboard as an organic option. If you do the landscape fabric, just make sure that you have a way to water that, because a lot of landscape fabrics or weed control barriers are not water permeable, especially if it's the plastic material. So if you're going to be planting in that, you need to either run soaker hoses or water emitter lines underneath of that to make sure your plants are getting enough water. And so when it comes to tilling, I know it's kind of been common practice in the last, century to till gardens every year. But there is some downsides to tilling when you're over-tilling your garden, especially in the home garden. One of the things that can happen is, number one, you're disturbing that soil structure, and so you can kind of defeat the purpose of building up a good soil chemistry and biodiversity in that soil. Number two, over-tilling can actually bring up weed seeds from underneath the ground, and so you might actually make the weeds worse by tilling. And in heavy clay soils, you can actually create what's called a hard pan, which is a really just hard, almost like cement layer a couple inches down from over-tilling. So you want to avoid tilling every year if you can. And like I said, if you can add compost every year to your soil, that compost will eventually sink down and improve the soil deeper and deeper. So this is a really, really good option for you. Now, if you don't want to, or if you don't have very good soil to begin with, what I would suggest is either tilling in compost, or you can grab bagged garden soil and actually till in, and that will just help introduce some better soil into your area that will help improve the structure of it. Now, if you have really heavy clay soil like me, you want to avoid working the soil, meaning tilling or digging or anything, when the soil is wet. Because when clay soil is wet and then you work it, it will dry in big, heavy, hard clumps, which will then make it hard for plants to grow in, for roots to extend. So you want to avoid ever working really, really wet soil. And so once you have your in-ground bed established, what are some ways to keep it successful? Well, mulch. So I really recommend mulching with an organic material. So that could be undyed wood mulch, it could be wood chips, it could be straw, it could be leaves, it can be pine needles, and use stuff that's available. If you have a property where you get a lot of fallen leaves or pine needles, use those things. You can actually mulch with compost, and I do that in my raised beds quite a bit. Because this is a perennial garden and because it's in ground, I will get more weed seeds than I would normally in my raised bed. So I will be, once all my plants are planted, I will be mulching with probably either wood chips or an undyed bag mulch. And mulch does lots of things for a garden bed. It will suppress weeds, it will retain moisture so you're having to water less, and again, it will eventually break down and add organic matter to the soil. So mulching is a really, really good way to improve the soil in your garden, to keep down weeds, and to help keep your plants cool and happy and healthy. Now, if you have just a veggie garden and you're not having perennial plants that will come back every year, you want to protect your soil over the winter, so into fall and into winter. And there's lots of ways you can do that. You can plant a cover crop like I talked about earlier. You can add a couple layers of compost. You can put shredded leaves on top. And what this will do is it will protect from harsh winds over the winter. It will eventually break down. As I've said a million times before, it'll add organic matter to your soil. So protecting your soil over the winter is a really, really good idea. So that's it for video number 4. I hope you enjoyed this video about best practices for in-ground gardening. My next video will be best practices for raised bed gardening, which is actually my preferred method of gardening. And so I'll have lots to say on that. But please subscribe and let me know if you have any ideas or questions. Please leave them in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Bye.